Universalist Fellowship of Manhattan, we aim to be a vibrant, inclusive congregation. UUFM is widely known as a safe haven and a force for social justice. Now, being a force for social justice these days often means getting involved with questions of gender and sexuality. And some of those questions are what our program is about today. More on that later. I am particularly happy to be the convener today when the talk is about the Unitarian Universalist, our whole lives and about your sexuality. Because back in the late 70s, early 80s, 3 or 4 times, I was a co-leader of a teenage program that the Unitarians put out called About Your Sexuality. That meant that every week, for 10 weeks, I got together with a person who was about 15 years older than me, and we talked about the lesson plan that the Unitarian Universalist Association provided. We talked about our own attitudes towards sex. And let me tell you, being able to talk about sex for a couple of hours every week for 10 weeks with another person older, and in fact, a few years later, I did the same thing, but with a person about 15 years younger than me, that is transforming. So, more on the program later. If you are here in person and have a joy or a sorrow that you would like to have shared later in the service, please write it down. You can find Joys and Sorrows papers in a box on a seat nearby. We'll pick it up later to read aloud. If you're here on Zoom, we'll invite you later to type it into the chat. And I can't see without my glasses, can't see in a distance, so I don't know if we have any visitors, but if we do, visitors and newcomers, please chat with us after the service. Those of you on our Zoom can talk about what we're all about with Karen Hummel. So now let's acknowledge that we are standing and worshiping on a land that was populated by indigenous peoples when we Europeans came. Taryn.
Good morning. So on Thursday, a bunch of us gathered, thanks to Dan Swenson and others, watching Joseph Campbell's, I think it's the Power of Myth series, and that stimulated some thoughts. So he has a point at the interview where he's talking about a plant growing and sensing the sun, and he declares, because it can turn towards the sun, it's conscious, and that all living things are conscious and have this sort of spirit inside. And so that later, like in the conversation, says, well, we're all just the eyes and ears and voices for the universe, and so that it can have a unique perspective of itself. And I think that's a beautiful thought, and I think the first time I heard that, I was kind of bitter about it. Like, what a selfish universe. Why put people through all the things they have to go through just to get a little more data or unique experiences? That seems really poor choices. But I don't think it's like that. I think that every molecule, or even things that we can't sense or see, has this energy. So I want you to just like plant your feet on the ground and just feel the thrum of energy fill you, and let your proteins just like get a little buzz to work a little bit more efficiently to produce energy and more power for you to go do good in the world. So with that thrum, that energy, we're going to use that to acknowledge that this land was occupied by Indigenous peoples, and there are still a lot of things that need repair, bonds that need repaired, relationships that need repaired, and we can now use that thrum and that energy to go out and make repair. Thanks.
Thank you, Taryn. When I was a runner long years ago, I loved to run barefoot. And as Taryn was saying, there was a thrum of energy coming up into my bare feet that made it easier and more fun to run. So thank you for that insight, Taryn. In the early 1960s, directors of religious education were responding to parent and youth requests for help navigating the changing world of sexuality. They joined forces with the UUA to create a new sexuality curriculum for middle schoolers called About Your Sexuality. I have some recollection that the UUA was sued in Boston for distributing pornography, but I'm not certain of that. Today, we have the Lifespan Sexuality Curriculum, Our Whole Lives, or OWL, created in collaboration with the good people of the United Church of Christ. We'll look at how sex education is religious education. You'll learn a thing or two. I can't resist introducing a moment of humor. In one of the sexuality classes that I taught with my older friend, the lesson plan involved the girls, these are middle school girls and middle school boys, the girls in one side of the room, the boys on the other side, the girls talking about what they were looking for, experience, or expecting on a first date. These are middle schoolers, remember. The boys were doing the same thing. When they got back together, and the girls said what they were looking for, among the things that they mentioned was that they'd like their first date to be with a boy who has some experience, so that there won't be awkward moments about what do we do next. So the girls wanted their first date to be with a boy who was experienced. The boys said, wait, how do we get experience? So there were lots of things that we talked about in those About Your Sexuality, and with the new curriculum, Our Whole Lives. Our speaker today is the Reverend Barbara Cornell. She was in an AYS class when she was a senior in high school. From 1993 to 2007, she was director of religious education, where she made sure to offer both About Your Sexuality and then Our Whole Lives to her community. Her ministry for the past 14 years is hospital chaplaincy at Providence Swedish Edmonds Hospital, just north of Seattle, Washington, where she also coordinates the bereavement program. Bereavement and sex really do go together. She is happily married to Dane Scott, a trained AYS facilitator, and they have 2 young adult children who naturally are both graduates of Our Whole Lives. So, Reverend Barbara Cornell.
Good morning. When we think about our children and what we want for them, we typically think of good health, a good education, work that will fulfill them, and meaning and purpose in their lives. What I'm wondering is, do we also think of a healthy sexuality and sex life? Sexuality is so central to our identity and our ability to live fulfilling lives. Our society helps us help our kids develop academic excellence and athletic skills, even musical training. but our culture really lets our kids down when it comes to learning about healthy sexuality. Here is one person's take on our current situation. This is a quote from a recent column written by Carolyn Hacks of Dear Carolyn from the Washington Post. I'm grateful the Seattle Times carries Dear Carolyn. She is amazing. This is a partial quote from her answer to a husband who isn't talking with his wife about how he feels about their sex life. Quote, most of us arrive at committed relationships unprepared for these conversations, despite some heroic efforts in public health to counteract misinformation and prudery. She inserts a wonderful resource here. There are still well-meaning but misguided parents burying their awkwardness and avoidance and inane body part pseudonyms. Then peer and fear culture jumps in to stereotype us into airless little boxes. Then reactionaries shriek about drawings in library books, while a pipeline of live action smut gushes to devices owned by middle schoolers whose eyeballs simply cannot be supervised and controlled enough to protect them. End quote. I think that about sums it up. Our children deserve better. And thanks to many wonderful educators over the past 60 years in the UUA, we have very helpful programs to support a healthy sexuality for everyone. Our current program is a lifespan program with different curricula for different ages, and it's called Our Whole Lives, or OWL. The most comprehensive of the curricula is designed for middle school age children, the age when most of them are not yet sexually active. This, according to the experts, is a good time to learn. This topic is very near and dear to my heart because, as you learned from my short biographical statement, I was a participant in the first UUA Comprehensive Sexuality Education Program called About Your Sexuality, or AYS, when I was in high school. Its creation story is a good one, and we'll get to it in a minute. For now, just know that I came from a home where we didn't talk about sexuality except in a mocking or humorous way. I thought that was pretty typical. I got a lot of vibes, not actual education, from our culture and movies, where it was pretty clear that sexuality was powerful and important. Looking back at that AYS class that I attended with my friends and thinking about my life, I can see that I made some major decisions based on the information I learned there. Not just the facts about birth control or sexually transmitted infections, but the values that they shared. The UU value of respect for others and respect for ourselves and our bodies, mutuality, compassion, equity, and all important, trust. They trusted us with this valuable information. All of us, all the youth had worth and dignity, not just the boys or the straight people. I did not get that from my family. I got that at church. It was as if they were saying to us, dear children, we love you. We want you to have the truthful, useful information so you can make healthy decisions for your life. This experience made a huge impression on me. It absolutely made me a UU for life. I found myself wondering, who are these people? I wondered, like, how did they push through their fear for their children to have the courage to give their youth information that they would need to make healthy choices? What I've learned is that About Your Sexuality was a passion project for several UU religious educators. In the 60s, American culture was coming to terms with the information about sexuality from the Kinsey Report, The report on men came out in the late 40s, and the one on women came out in the early 50s. And in 1960, the FDA approved a birth control pill. In the 60s, we were about 30 years out from the Humanist Manifesto, known now as Humanist Manifesto 1, to distinguish it from those that came after. That document saw sex as something that brought joy into our lives and that people deserved that joy. They also believed in the worth and dignity of youth. These things were more important to them than sin and salvation. A new national organization was formed during this time, 1964, called SICUS. That stands for the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States. Dr. Mary Calderon was one of the early founders. She was medical director at Planned Parenthood, and she had a lot of concerns about the general lack of accurate information about sexuality. Churches were hearing these concerns from parents, and they wanted to step in to help. 3 religious educators of that era who were central to the development of AYS all spoke with me in 2006 when I was in seminary writing my UU history paper on this topic. All 3 of them identified as humanist. Elaine Smith was the religious educator at University Unitarian Church starting in 1960, the largest UU church in the greater Seattle area. She had a wonderful support from her congregation to create a program of sexuality education for the youth. Parents made it clear that they needed help. The Reverend Dr. Roberta Nelson was religious educator for the First Parish in Needham, Massachusetts in the 60s. She too experienced the distress of parents at the lack of useful sexuality education for their kids. Both of these religious educators stressed to me that there was a great gap, and they felt the need to fill that gap. Both of them, in their local communities on either side of our country, were developing sex ed programs. In another example of medical doctors sounding the alarm, Dr. Nelson told me that her gynecologist wanted to work with her to help develop a program because young people were really in need of the information. She told me she reached out to other liberal congregations in the area to see what they were doing to support youth. The program they developed in Massachusetts was mainly a way to answer the questions of youth. Elaine Smith at University Unitarian also reached out to her local colleagues here in Seattle. She found that her counterpart at the University Disciples of Christ Church, Eugene Kidder, was very interested in joining her to create a program. And Eugene and Elaine worked together, and they created a cool program that I call for Seattle youth and their parents, that I call Seattle Freedom and Responsibility, to distinguish it from the UUA curriculum of the same name that was published in 1969. 2 different things. The Seattle version of Freedom and Responsibility had a unit on communication, one on law, one on health, and another on sexuality. Elaine found psychologists, lawyers, police, nurses, and doctors to help lead these groups. Now, they just did them for a pretty short while to help them figure out that the most popular unit was the one on sexuality. They found, by asking in the parent education community here in Seattle, they found a PhD student at the West Seattle Y, Derek Calderwood, who was doing sexuality education research for his PhD. He had very creative ideas about how to help the adult facilitators and the youth get on the same page with language, and that made it possible for them to talk over the course of the next periods of, as long as the program would last. And he also had a wonderful way to manage the question issue, like how do you get questions and answer them? Very creative. Any sexuality education program that the UUs would create, both of these educators told me, must have facilitators willing to answer every question that the youth had. All three educators I spoke to felt strongly about this point. It was central to AYS, and it remains so today in the OWL program. I had the opportunity through the miracle of interlibrary loan to read Derek's dissertation. He learned some very important things in his research at the West Seattle Y, including that the highest priorities for learning from the youth were topics that no one would talk to them about, and that they didn't necessarily want to go right out right away and do the things they were learning about. This is a fear that a lot of parents have about sex education, is that their kids will learn about things and then want to go do them right away. And that turned out not to be the case. Another innovation he brought us was how important it was to have boys and girls in the same class learning together. I so appreciate the example Larry shared. That's a beautiful learning they would never have if they were in separate rooms having that conversation. Um, the youth who go through this program can bring up issues that a lot of other youth do not, cannot, and will not talk about with their partner. This turns out to be so incredibly important. Most puberty information is shared in sex segregated classrooms and schools. So that's what the norm is. He also learned, I thought this was really interesting, that parent education level has nothing to do with parent willingness to talk with their kids about sex. Very educated parents aren't better at talking to their kids. I thought that was really cool. When asked where they learn about sex, most youth rated the sex education they got at church as the worst. And this was to change over the next 50 years for many children and youth in UU congregations. The best sex education I got was at church. And I'm just one of thousands of people who went to UU churches and can say that. The third religious educator in this remarkable story was the head of curriculum development at the UUA at the time, Reverend Hugo Holleroth, known as Holly to everyone. When we spoke, Holly shared with me how pivotal a Laredo conference was in the development of this desire in the UUA to create an education program for youth. Now, Laredo is the Liberal Religious Educators Association. It's their professional organization for UU religious educators. And in 1967, they chose sexuality education as their theme. And Derek came to the conference. Elaine, had been working with him, and she brought him. And he shared some of the exercises that he'd been using with the religious educators. So, think on this. Most of those people who came to that conference had a home like mine, with parents like mine who didn't talk about sexuality. And the experience they had just made a huge impression on them. At the conference, they all had this lived experience of how important it was going to be for this curriculum to go forward. It was at the conference that Holly asked Derek to please be the author of the UUA sex ed curriculum. Their passion for this project carried them through the many, many challenges of writing it, creating the visuals, producing the audio files. They used film strips with all the data and the information that they wanted to share. This passion carried them through the many field tests and finally to the publication of About Your Sexuality. There were so many challenges, just many. And definitely the most notable challenge was brought by a conservative district attorney in Brookfield, Wisconsin, a suburb of Milwaukee. The Brookfield UU congregation was using the curriculum, and the district attorney, Robert McConnell, got wind of what it included, which was, the visuals and all the information about homosexuality, and he threatened to sue the church. The UUA president at the time, Robert Nelson West, saw to it that a team of obscenity lawyers from Boston, experts, coached the Wisconsin lawyers who ultimately had to take the case all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court kicked it back to the Court of Appeals, which said essentially, churches are the entity that decide what they will teach their children. While all this court business was going on, there was an election and Mr. McConnell was soundly defeated. I thought that was really an amazing story. Just as a really fun side note, UUA President Robert Nelson West was also instrumental in the Beacon Press decision to publish the Pentagon Papers. A very interesting person. So, who were these people? How did they push through their concerns and fears to help their children? They wanted more for their youth than ignorance and fear. This beautiful curriculum that never once says Unitarian Universalism anywhere in it tells you a lot about these amazing UUs. It doesn't say our name, but our faith is absolutely the inspiration for all of it. Unitarians and Universalists and Unitarian Universalists have always cared about the truth and about the application of reason to improve our lives right here and right now. We all come from a long line of liberal religious folks who were always willing to take great risks to do the right thing. Comprehensive human sexuality education with our UU values is absolutely the right thing. It was then with AYS, and it still is now with our whole lives. Amen and blessed be.